American friends have taken a strong moral stance against the PLO and Fatah's exploitation of perennial Palestinian refugees, and Canada has now stepped up to help the exploiters and the terrorists, and Justin Trudeau is using your tax dollars to do it. Earlier this year, the United States pulled all of its funding to the United Nations organization tasked with doling the cash back out to Palestinian leadership from the times of Israel. The United States was the biggest contributor to the agency's budget in 2017, donating $350 million. The U.S. State Department said last month it would no longer fund UNRWA because it was irredeemably flawed. And now the United Nations is crying poverty and a $200 million annual shortfall because instead of throwing good money after bad, the Americans have offered a solution to the so-called refugee problem in Judea and Samaria. And it was a real solution being offered to the United Nations by the Trump administration. Just look at this here. In June, Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat said Jared Kushner was willing to stop funding UNRWA altogether and transfer the $300 million the U.S. gives the agency to Jordan and other Arab nations who would take in the Palestinians. So you see, the Americans weren't actually going to pull all of their funding dedicated to helping the Palestinians. Instead, they weren't going to give the money to the United Nations anymore. What they were going to do was use the funding to finally put an end to the refugee problem and get the refugees situated in countries that are culturally appropriate for them within the region, and actually make the Arab states in the Gulf finally step up and do something for once instead of just pointing at the Americans and the Israelis as the great Satan and, the little Satan. The Canadian government, under the leadership of Stephen Harper, cut off all funding to UNRWA in 2010 because of its close ties to the outlawed terrorist organization Hamas. In November 2016, Justin Trudeau's Liberals restored $25 million of that cut-off funding. In March 2018, the federal Liberals again injected another $10 million in emergency funding to UNRWA. You can see all of our coverage on Justin Trudeau's aid and sympathy for Hamas at stophelpinghamas.com. And now Justin Trudeau, always one to stand on the wrong side of an issue, especially if it gives him a chance to slap our American allies in the face, is giving another $50 million annually to UNRWA. Oh, and the federal government is doing it in direct response to the United States cutting their funding to this terror-linked UN organization. The Liberals said as much. According to reports in the Huffington Post, Canada is earmarking $40 million towards the basic education, health, and livelihood needs of millions of Palestinian refugees, especially women and children. That sounds benevolent, but let's go back a little, shall we? The Palestinian so-called refugees are a special class of refugee with their own United Nations agency dedicated to helping just them, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, or, as I called it earlier, UNRWA. Unlike other UN refugees who are fleeing war or famine or religious persecution and who are refugees only temporarily, these refugees are able to inherit their refugee status from their parents and grandparents who were displaced by a war they lost 70 years ago. They can live in normal apartment complexes in Ramallah or a neighborhood in Bethlehem, as any other person might. They are settled and often live in the same neighborhood for generations that the United Nations now calls a refugee camp for the purposes of wringing cash out of the Western world. More people classified as refugees, more aid dollars. It's really just that simple. This is what the American administration was trying to end by offering money to Arab states to settle these so-called refugees. UNRWA recognizes over 5 million Palestinians as refugees, even though there are only several tens of thousands of original Palestinian refugees still alive. If Israel is committing genocide, as the left likes to cry, This is the worst unsuccessful attempt at it I have ever seen. And this is a prime example of how inept UNRWA is. If, after 70 years of being tasked with solving this refugee problem, there are now 5 million of them and growing. The only reason refugee status for Palestinians is inheritable is because it's valuable, just like any other thing you might inherit or will to someone. Each refugee is worth millions in funding to be funneled to corruptocrats and terror organizations. Right here, according to the Middle East Eye, which, by the way, is not a pro-Israel publication at all. In fact, it routinely calls Israel an occupying force. Anyway, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, over $35 billion in aid has been spent on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip between 1993 and 2016. And of the $35 billion, around $24 billion, or 70% of the total aid, was allocated between 2006 and 2016 at an average of $2.2 billion per year and $560 per capita per year. Such figures make the Palestinians one of the top recipients of non-military per capita aid in the world. So where on earth is all this money going? Well, let's take a quick look at what happens in those UNRWA schools that Canada is now so committed to funding. Here. That's a tiny tot terror dress rehearsal, and thanks to Canadian aid dollars now, those kids will graduate well-trained in the art of terror and will have a well-paying job in the global jihad when they grow up. This is from the New York Post. The new Palestinian Authority budget boosts support to terrorists in prison by 13% and aid for the families of those killed in the struggle against Zion 4%, reports the Institute for Contemporary Affairs. The total, $344 million, equals 49.6% of all foreign aid to the Palestinian Authority. In other words, cash from Uncle Sam, Europe, and even Israel is subsidizing welfare for terrorists. The Palestinian Authority sends a salary to each Palestinian imprisoned for an attack on Israelis, hitting over $3,000 per month after 30 years. Other stipends go to families of martyrs killed in the act. That's $344 million for 2017. That's not going to build roads or hospitals. But friends, that's not to say that some Palestinians living in Judea and Samaria are not doing well for themselves as international aid dollars rain down on them like manna from heaven. I took a little trip over to the website of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. They have a photo album on their website devoted to documenting the luxury that exists for some Palestinians who claim to be living under this so-called oppressive Israeli occupation. Just look at some of these houses of rich Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, while the UN cries poverty, genocide, occupation, and apartheid at Israel on like a near weekly basis. So yeah, of course UNRWA is running out of funds to help these refugees. That's because the money they send to help the so-called displaced, although completely resettled people, ends up buying PLO and Fatah politicians fancy houses and nice cars, and allows martyrs' mothers to live in luxury because one of their sons knifed a soldier, kidnapped and murdered a tour guide, or butchered an Israeli child as she lay in her bed. And Trudeau is obviously aware of all of this. The entire world is aware of this. The problem is some of the world thinks Israelis deserve to live in terror every single day. But for Justin Trudeau, it is most important to be seen as the global leader of the anti-Trump cabal and to be seen by his progressive peers to be doing exactly the opposite of President Donald Trump. And Trudeau will do that. He is doing exactly that, even if it means lining the pockets of butchers who exploit their own people to fulfill their vision of a world without Israel or without Jews. Because for Trudeau, what's a few stabbed soldiers if it means you get to virtue signal about how much you aren't like President Donald Trump? And for a liberal mainstream media that incessantly calls anybody to the right of Barack Obama alt-right or white nationalist, they're sure silent with their outrage now that liberals are proudly dishing over money to people who have the same ideology and endgame as modern neo-Nazis. For the Rebel.media, I'm Sheila Gunn Reid. To see all of our ongoing coverage of how Justin Trudeau is forking over your money to this terrorist organization, go to stophelpinghamas.com.